The idea basically is that, again, your system only cares about contrast, right? So, this thing is kind of greener than its kind of reddish surroundings, so it looks, overall it kind of looks green to you. This one is kind of like yellower than its bluish surroundings, so it tends to look yellow to you, right? Because your system is kind of focused on the contrast between things, not the absolute or sort of the true balance of the wavelength set, right? Okay. So this is weird, right? Because again, this is one of these strange inverse problem situations you kind of get, right? Where like what you find is that like you can have kind of a greenish percept, even though the thing is not actually that green, or you have kind of a yellowish percept, even though the actual stimulus is not that yellow, right? So you have if these were real objects, you would kind of have well, it's sort of almost the opposite of the inverse problem, right? So when we talk about the inverse problem, we say, well, you can, the same thing that you perceive could be produced by two different stimuli. It's also the case that like the same stimulus, the same actual wavelength of light, can produce two different like percepts or experiences, right? Based on kind of what the context is. I think we'll actually see this better in a, this is probably even a better demo of this that is a little bit clearer. So just to show you a different version of this. So there's a couple different ways if you ever look for this diagram online that you might see this, but this particular one, if you look at these spots on the left that look blue to you, right? So that would be these four like spots on this kind of Rubik's Cube, right? And look at these yellow spots on the right on this Rubik's Cube. So it may seem, hopefully it looks pretty clear to you guys that the blue spots look blue on the left, the yellow spots look yellow on the left, right? But it turns out that the blue spots on the left cube and the yellow spots on the right cube are in fact the exact same color, or the color experience is whatever it is in your head. But the wavelengths of these spots versus these spots are in fact exactly the same, and both of them are actually a totally neutral gray color, or a gray wavelength. In other words, they're kind of equally balanced wavelengths of all different colors. So it's like basically white light, right? So here on the left, let's look at like one of the blue rectangles, or one of the blue spots on the cube. And what I'm going to do is just kind of like gradually mask it out, right? So you can see with these animations, I didn't change the color in this thing at all as I was putting these other squares in here. But once I get rid of the color context, you can now see that this is just kind of a neutral gray, right? But in context, it looks blue, right? So if you watch it again, one more time, no funny business going on here, right? So if you watch very carefully, this dot, you can see that nothing is actually changing. It's just that I'm masking out the surroundings, right? So nothing changed there, nothing changed there, nothing changed there, nothing changed there. But as I put those in, that blue spot turns gray before your very eyes because I have gotten rid of this yellow surround, right? And here's a neutral gray, like, exactly between black and white on this projector square, and it's exactly the same shade as that quote-unquote blue dot, right? So I didn't do that on the right one, but you can trust me, or I can like zoom in on it, that the yellow dots over here are exactly the same, right? So I zoom way, 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 way in. Basically, you can't zoom all the way in, but you can see like when I get rid of 90% of the context, you can see that it looks pretty much just gray to you. And as I zoom out again, it magically turns back to yellow, right? So what this tells us, right, is that this kind of color opponency system is used in the same way that like our just brightness contrast works for our achromatic systems, which is kind of essentially subtracts out the overall illumination, right? So what your visual system is essentially doing with this color opponency system is you are quote unquote aware that the overall illumination on this side of the picture seems to be yellow, and that the overall it looks like this is in a room filled with blue light over here and yellow light over here, right? And this color opponency system essentially allows you to like subtract out the background, right? So what you've got here, right, is what you've truly got over here is a neutral or gray piece of light, right? So it has all equal wavelengths of light, right? But what you infer from this background is that overall the background is yellow, right? So if you've got mostly yellow light coming in, and this thing reflects kind of an equal amount of all wavelengths back at you, that actually means that this thing is less yellow on average than everything else, right? which means in turn that like it actually, your visual system kind of infers that it's blue, right? Because it's kind of less yellow than the average light in here. So another way to think about that is like, if you look at what looks like white in this, if you zoom in on it enough, you should see that it's actually kind of like light yellow, right? Even though it kind of looks like a white color to you. It's actually kind of the same color as the average kind of illumination of yellow in the background, right? And similarly over here, the thing that looks yellow to you, is actually kind of a neutral gray color, but because you know that the average color of this whole scene is bluish, something, I don't know how this, like what a good example of this, right, is. So maybe it's let's say you're, have you ever done that experiment where you put one of your hands in cold water and one of your hands in hot water and hold them there for a minute, and you take them both out and you plunge them both into like room temperature water? Has anybody done that thing? Okay, so what happens when you do that, right, is like your hand that is used to being hot goes into the neutral water or the room temperature water and it suddenly feels cold. And your hand that has been in the cold water the whole time goes into the room temperature water and it suddenly feels hot. It's that same kind of thing, right, where something that is actually kind of neutral, in contrast, goes kind of in the opposite direction, right? So even though this is actually grayish, in contrast to its surroundings, which are overall on average bluish, something that is actually a neutral balance of wavelengths, your visual system kind of subtracts out that bluish background and infers that this thing is actually yellower than the background. And that's why it looks yellow to you. Okay, I don't know if does that make sense? Do you guys have questions about any of that stuff so far? Hopefully this does make sense, right? Okay, so what this means, right, is that like, you may not even be aware of this, but your lighting conditions, like what looks like white light to us is really not the same shade of white all the time, right? So if you look at like the lights in this room, for example, if you look right at these lights, which I don't recommend doing for like a long time, right? To me at least, they look like they're kind of like a reddish shade, right? They have a little bit more red in them than like what I would consider to be pure white light. If you look up at the sun, the sun is like yellow, right, most of the time. So, the sun is giving kind of a like, not pure white light, it's giving kind of a yellow tinged white light. And similarly, like, if it's kind of getting close to sunset, the shading of the sunlight changes. If you're in a room that has, different kinds of light bulbs, what we call white light is not quite the same. But the key thing is that the colors you experience don't change very much, even if the tone of the light illuminating them shifts, right? And that's all due to this kind of color contrast system that makes colors of things look about the same, regardless of like the sort of tone of the light that's coming in, right? So it's very useful because you don't want to walk into a room. We have this problem a little bit, right? We've all probably had this issue where we like pick out a shirt that looks, dark blue in a store, and then you get home and in a different light it looks like it's purple or something, or you think it's black and it's really blue or whatever, right? So, your color perception does change based on illumination, but it doesn't change much, right? And you have your like color contrast system to thank for that, basically, is that even if the overall illumination changes in color tone a little bit, red things still look red to you, green things still look green for the most part, right? Okay. I don't want to dwell on this because this is kind of the same idea, but it's sort of expressed in opposite way. So another thing that you can see, this is actually, I think, the same photo, but just kind of highlighting different squares. So if you look at the squares like here that look reddish to you, right? So that would be these two, and this one, and that one, right? So if you look at those quote-unquote red squares, right, on the left, and you look at these same like spatially positioned squares on the right, which also look red, right? So they probably don't look exactly the same to you, but you would infer that all of these squares are actually red, right? So you'd say, okay, yeah, this is the same Rubik's Cube, right? That these are all the red squares on the Rubik's Cube, these are all the red squares on the Rubik's Cube. If you actually zoom in on them, you find that the true wavelengths of these quote-unquote red faces are actually kind of orange on the left, and they're actually kind of purple on the right? So if we zoom in on them, hopefully we can see that. Let's see if that works. So zoom in on one of the reds, and you can see it's actually, kind of this orange tone, and what looks like roughly the same shade of red over here, if you zoom in on it, is actually a much purpler tone. Right? Oops, I had a slide, right? So they look like they're both red when you kind of zoom out and you see it in their light context, but they are, this percept of red versus, or this percept that like these are red in both cases is actually produced by totally different shades of light, right? So again, this is like the inverse problem, which is like your perception of red, quote unquote red, can actually be driven by either orange or purple, wavelengths, depending on kind of what your visual system is inferring about the background lighting, right? Okay. Questions about that so far? Everybody hanging in there okay? Okay. So another good example of this, hopefully this will work for you guys. So what color are these strawberries? Don't overthink this, but like what color are they?
Red.
Okay, red, right? So you would say those, I mean, you can tell that the lighting is kind of blue, but those are clearly red strawberries, right? But if we open up this picture in Photoshop, which I will not do, which will let us kind of actually, oops, so we'll actually open, okay, if we open this up in Photoshop, here's this image, right? I can like zoom way in on it. I can probably just show you this by zooming, right? So if I zoom way in on this red, it starts putting like the grid in for the individual pixels. But what you should be able to see is that what looked red to you was not actually red. It was just kind of grayish, right? But when I zoom out and put it in this kind of blue light context, it looks red again, right? And if I use the eyedropper tool, which what this does in Photoshop is it lets you kind of like whatever color the eyedropper is over, it lets you kind of like see this in the color picker, right? I think I can actually do it. Yeah, I can do it this way. Yeah, so this color that's changing right here is whatever color I'm kind of hovering over, right? And what you see is if I hover over like white, it's kind of a lighter shade. But these are all really different shades of blue or green for the most part, right? None of the stuff in here is actually red. Like the sort of reddest it gets is like kind of grayish, right? And it's only the fact that like you have the sense, or the overall background illumination is assumed to be kind of bluish green, that the things that are actually kind of gray or neutral in their color balance are kind of inferred to be red by you, right? And you can kind of see that there. Okay. So anyway, that's just lots of kind of examples of the same thing, but I think it's kind of neat that like, it's not just that things look redder, in blue light or whatever, but there is no actual red light. Or what I should say is, it's kind of gray light, right, which has an equal mix of like red, green, and blue. But it's not, the light is not tipped in favor of the red direction, right? It's just that the overall inference that the illumination is bluish green makes those strawberries look red to you. Okay. Now, any discussion of this? I don't want to spend a lot of time on this because I think everyone by now is super sick of this this thing that kind of went crazy on the internet 3 or 4 years ago. Or do we? So who in this room like sees this dress as yellow or like gold and white? All right, who sees it as blue and black? All right, good. Can anybody switch? All right, I have looked at this thing so many times that I can't even tell anymore. It just kind of looks like in between to me now. So the internet went crazy for this because for whatever reason, this like dress, which I assume we've all seen, some people feel very strongly that it looks yellow and gold, or like gold and white. Some people feel very strongly that it looks black and blue. I believe it is actually a black and blue dress that just has, like it was sort of shot against very bright light and kind of looks white and gold to people. But the same basic principle of this like color constancy underlies why people see it. Now, it doesn't underlie why people see it differently. I think the reason people see it differently is because for whatever reason, this image seems to capture like slight individual differences in our nervous systems that like some of us are kind of making different assumptions than other of us. But the sort of reason it could look both ways is because of the same color constancy effect, right? So if you were like a blue-black person,